Today's presentation is intended to help you when you have to inspect the upper and lower connecting rod bearings. Before starting work, we have opened all indicator cocks, closed the starting air shutoff valve and engaged the turning gear. All necessary information will be found in the maintenance manual, Group 330, pages 1 to 6, and Group 332, pages 1 and 1A. Afterwards, read up carefully in the maintenance manual the instructions which have been given in the course of this film. Always use the recommended tools, and when assembling, make sure that everything is spotlessly clean. These tools are needed for the bearing inspections which now follow. The hydraulic tools must be in good condition. At the beginning of the worksheets, you will always find a list of tools with the appropriate code number. You can identify the tools from the index at the end of the maintenance manual, Group 940. After stopping the oil pumps, the crankcase doors can be opened. The engine is turned until the respective piston is exactly at bottom dead center. The crank angle corresponding to bottom dead center is calculated from the angle for top dead center plus or minus 180 degrees. Note the corresponding mark for top dead center on the flywheel. Under no circumstances may the engine be turned while inspecting the crosshead bearing. Therefore, the main switch on the turning gear must be secured, for example by attaching a lock. We advise measuring the bearing clearances before starting with the inspection in order to determine any bearing wear. At bottom dead center, the clearances of both connecting rod bearings may be measured at the same time. Note the directions in the maintenance manual, Group 330, page 1. The correct bearing clearance may be obtained from the clearance table in the maintenance manual, Group 012, page 5. The bearing clearance cannot be adjusted. Worn bearings must be replaced. The top connecting rod bearings are normally tensioned hydraulically. Note the directions in the maintenance manual, Group 330, pages 2 to 2D. Read the instructions given in the maintenance manual, Group 940, page OD, on working with the hydraulic tensioning tools. Remember that the hydraulic pre-tensioning jacks always have to be turned back by about half a turn when slackening. Make sure that all high-pressure connections are clean and undamaged. Keep the vent plugs open till oil emerges without bubbles. The pressure is raised to about 620 bar till the nuts can be slackened by means of a Tommy bar. The second crosshead bearing is loosened in the same way as the first one. The connecting rod bolts must not be lowered to inspect the bearings. They are fixed by means of these holders. To prevent the bearing covers dropping down when the crosshead is lifted, they are retained with this holding stirrup. The connecting rod must be secured in the vertical attitude with this fastening device while the crosshead is raised. Look it up in the Maintenance Manual, Group 330, page 5A. With the help of this jack and supporting pieces, the crosshead is lifted out of the bearings together with the piston till the bearings can be inspected. For safety reasons, this non-return shut-off valve must be fitted before the jack. With the shut-off valve closed, the crosshead is lifted only enough to allow insertion of the shortest supporting piece. Center the supporting piece exactly under the piston rod and open the valve on the pump first. Then slowly open the shut-off valve till the crosshead rests on the supporting piece. For safety reasons, the jack is forced up again till it touches the crosshead. The shut-off valve must be closed for this. In this position, the bearing running surfaces can be inspected. Should it be necessary to remove the bearing shell, the crosshead must be raised by pushing supporting pieces, each of greater length, under it till the longest one can be positioned. The bolts must be lowered to do this. Look it up in the Maintenance Manual, Group 330, page 5A. Removing and fitting bearing shells is described in the Maintenance Manual, Group 330, page 5B. Depending on the instructions of the classification surveyor, the bearing is reassembled with the original bearing shell or a new one. Here we'd like to say a few things about assessing crosshead bearings. The crosshead shell bearing on RTA 58, 68, 76 and 84 engines is made of an aluminium tin alloy. Here you can see the structure. First a steel shell back, then the actual bearing metal, an aluminium tin alloy, and finally a very thin layer called overlay. A bearing shell that has been in operation may be fitted again only if this overlay is still in good condition. This bearing shell may be fitted again. But this one here represents a borderline case. Bearing shells in worse condition than this have to be replaced. The crosshead pin must be in good condition, especially if a new bearing shell has to be fitted. Depending on their state, scratched crosshead pins must be reground, chrome plated or replaced. The bearing is assembled in the reverse order. Note the directions in the Maintenance Manual, Group 330, pages 2C, 2D and 5B. When assembling, use the oil grade specified in the Maintenance Manual, Group 330, page 5B. With the shut-off valve closed, the crosshead is lifted slightly and the supporting piece removed. First open the valve of the pump, then the shut-off valve slowly, so that the crosshead is lowered. While lowering it, make sure that the bolt threads are not damaged by the bearing covers. As soon as the crosshead is resting on the bearings, the holding brackets for the bearing covers and the connecting rod may be removed. The bolt threads and nut contact surfaces must be coated with Molykote G paste and the bolt nuts tightened up evenly by hand using a spanner. Bolts and nuts must be in contact without clearance. The protrusion is measured with the feeler gauge. Compare the values x1 plus x2 with the value indicated in the maintenance manual, group 330, page 2C, for your engine type. Note the directions in the maintenance manual, group 940, page OD, on working with hydraulic pre-tensioning jacks. After venting the jacks, the pressure is first brought up to 450 bar and held constant. Having tightened the nuts, with the feeler gauge, make sure that they are in proper contact. With this preload, the bearing shell must be pressed in so firmly that there is no longer any clearance between the lower part of the bearing and the bearing cover. After making a reference mark on the nuts, the pressure is raised to 600 bar and the nuts are tightened with a Tommy bar till they are in flush contact. Check with the feeler gauge that the nuts are in proper contact before lowering the pressure. Having removed the jacks, the angle through which the two nuts have been tightened is to be assessed by comparison with the marks made previously. The nuts should have been turned by the same amount. If there are big differences, especially with a particular pair of nuts, the tensioning operation must be repeated. Finally, the axial and radial clearances are checked. Note the directions in the maintenance manual, group 330, page 1. The engine is turned till the piston in question is at top dead center. Check the top dead center mark on the flywheel. The bottom connecting rod bearing bolts are released and tightened in exactly the same way as those on the top connecting rod bearing. Observe strictly all directions in the first part of this film on the loosening and tightening of the connecting rod bearing bolts. Bottom connecting rod bearings with 4 bolts must be loosened and tightened crosswise. This is described in the maintenance manual, group 330, pages 2 to 2D. The bearing is lowered carefully and evenly onto the bottom of the bed plate. Make sure that the bolts do not damage the crank pin during this operation. Secure the bearing by holding one of the bolts while lowering it so that it cannot tip over. The engine is turned till the crank of the particular cylinder has the angle alpha. The angle alpha for your engine may be found in the maintenance manual, group 330, page 4A, figure C. To enable the bearing to be inspected, the crosshead must be fixed to its guide paths with these 4 holding pins. Turn the 4 holding pins in their eccentrics till they are up against the guide shoes. Before the crankshaft can be turned out of the bearing, the connecting rod must be held with a chain block in this swung out position. These Allen screws must not be taken out to inspect the bearing. The crankshaft is turned out of the bearing a little. Then the connecting rod is centered with the chain block so that it no longer touches the crank pin radially. The crankshaft is turned further till there is enough room to inspect the bearing. Make sure that the crank does not strike against the bearing lying on the bed plate. Should it be necessary to replace the bearing, you'll find the appropriate directions in the maintenance manual, Group 330, pages 4 and 4A. The bearing is reassembled in the reverse order. The bearing running surfaces are given a generous application of clean engine oil. When turning back, watch that the crank pin goes into the bearing without radial pressure. Now the chain block is removed and the crankshaft is turned a little further. The 4 holding pins are now removed. The chains on them serve to indicate that the holding pins are still inside the engine. To assemble the bearing, the crankshaft is turned to top dead center again. The bearing is to be cleaned and oiled. Make sure that the bolts do not damage the crank pin when the bearing is lifted. Coat the nut contact surface and the threads with Molykote G paste. Before unloading the jacks, check with the feeler gauge that the nuts are in proper contact. All data for tightening may be found in the maintenance manual, Group 013, pages 1 and 2. After fitting all locking devices, the crankshaft is turned to bottom dead center to check the bearing clearance. Verify once more that all locking devices have been fitted, that there are no tools or other foreign objects inside the engine, and in particular that the 4 holding pins have been removed. In this film, you've been able to follow an inspection of the connecting rod bearings. Now, all the parts have been properly assembled and the engine is once again ready to go into operation. If you have questions about any aspect of this film, or indeed any questions about Sulzer engines, please contact your nearest Sulzer representative. Our worldwide organization is ready and willing to help you. During the next few hours of operation, the temperature of the respective bearings should be checked manually and compared with the neighboring ones.